It was Markowitz back when I was in kindergarten who said, let's take a bunch of securities, we'll call it a portfolio, and put them in a risk-return space, the standard deviation being the risk horizontally and the return going vertically. And he showed mathematically that the lines connecting the various combinations either were possibly straight or bended to the left. And when you put them all together, this set, we're going to call it a feasible set, turns out had to be continuous and smooth bending to the left. Now separately, people like De Breu, Arrow, von Morgenstern showed that people had a preference not only for higher returns, but lower risk because losing money hurts more than making money. And when you overlay these on top of each other with the work of Markowitz, you get some interesting properties. And further, when you add in the risk-free security, something really profound occurs. And that is the people who had been on the uppermost portion of the feasible set, if let's say they're rational, will have moved up to that line created with the risk-free security. We call that the capital market line. And here we have a gal who, a little red dot, has moved further up and to the left, preferentially, using the risk-free and only the market. Here we have a guy, blue, again, moved upward and to the left. He's a little bit more risk-tolerant. And what's interesting, they're both better off, and they are using what is called market separation, only the risk-free and the market portfolio. And now, because everybody is acting rationally, I know, we can transfer this to a more generalized case, now with the horizontal being the beta, the relationship to the market, the slope, if you will, I know, covariance over the variance of the market, and it turns out that this line, we call it the security market line, is true, and people can still choose to wherever they want to be on that line. And most basic analyses stop somewhere around in here with the idea that if it's above the security market line, you accept the project investment and vice versa. By the way, note here that the slope of this line is the market premium, the return to the market minus the risk-free rate, where now the X variable is now the beta. And you can choose that. But as everybody knows, in every field that anybody's ever studied, there's theory and then there's practice. And it turns out that really, in theory, you only have one risk-free rate. But in practice, people don't borrow and lend at the same rates, do they? And generally, people would borrow if they wanted to take on a higher beta, that is a greater risk than that of the market, and borrow at a higher rate, and they would lend at a lower rate, the risk-free, and the higher rate, among other things, is because the risk of the borrower is relevant, whereas in the risk-free rate, the lending, the risk of the treasury bill is lower. And this leads to a hot topic in finance and investing, and that is when you put a single line through a regression of this data, through this kinky data, you find that you almost invariably get a positive intercept. We call that alpha. We'll see that again later. And people like to chase the alpha, so to speak, because it's supposedly the autonomous return of the firm. In a different but not contradictory aspect, and going beyond the standard capital asset pricing model, is something called the arbitrage pricing theory. It starts off by noting that the classic CAPM is really just a linear equation. See, there's that alpha again. It's an intercept plus the beta times some x. And you could have various factors, various inputs. You know, like somebody's height could be a function of age, genetics, gender, diet, and so on. There's one that I like to point out, and in doing these analyses, they like to do something called factor rotation, trying to get the biggest bang for the buck with the fewest number of inputs. To give a hopefully clearer idea of what's going on here, somebody did a study of spaghetti sauces, ragu and prego. One's kind of for the kids, the other one's kind of for the adults, and they put in stuff that seemed to matter: income, age, urban, rural, kids, whether they own the home. You get the idea. And they did the analysis, and the result came back, well, sure enough, age matter, education, kids, urban, rural, apartment, home. But when they squished the factors down to one, the single factor turned out to be whether they had a dog or a cat. And they said, oh, that can't be true. But wait a minute, they checked and it was. And guess what? Cat owners tend to be childless, urban, apartment owners, well-educated, and vice versa. And it actually made sense once you thought about it. And as it turned out, to really nobody's surprise, that the four factors of the APT were interest rates, inflation, yield spreads, that's the width, not the height, of various graded bonds in terms of their yields, and it kind of measures bankruptcy risk. And the fourth was productivity measures, which are like, wages and technology. And any beginning investing student probably would have come up with those on their own. But when the factors were resolved to one instead of four, it turned out that the single factor, get this, was the market. And look at that. The equations are parallel. The APT, the one-factor model, is just a generalized case where the capital asset pricing model is a single factor model. They're really the same thing. So bringing this all together, we see that, the real world is just a little more complex version of the capital asset pricing model, and that the multi-factor APT, when pushed, turns out to just confirm it. And here I've got a graph where I really demonstrate it in one nice presentation. Here I simulated 5 securities, A through E, and A has the highest. People love that one. E, on the other hand, worst standard deviation, the highest. Lowest return, nobody should like this security, but it's very negatively correlated. And it turns out, in an optimal security, trying to go up and to the left, you include a little bit, mind you, of E into an optimal portfolio. As I like to put it, it's like putting pepper into soup. You don't want a little bit, but it does make it better. And going beyond the CAPM in its basic form, a little bit of housekeeping here is probably in order. A little bit of higher math, you'll survive. A portfolio has weighted returns and weighted risks. It's a square matrix of various covariances and various weights. And if you, say, weight them equally naively and get a whole lot of them, the covariance of I to I, J to J against itself is the variance and always approaches 0, which means you can ignore company news, which means it's not smart to pick stocks. And in fact, we could come to that conclusion elsewhere, because notice picking stocks is inside the feasible set, and we want to be up and to the left, which is only that of the risk-free and the market, nothing else.